The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, tomsbeets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This is from the introduction. It starts with love, exchange, fellowship. It ends as it begins, in motion, in between various modes of being and belonging, and on the way to new economies of giving, taking, being with and for. And it ends with a ride in a Buick Skylark on a way to another place altogether. Surprising, perhaps, after we have engaged dispossession, debt, dislocation, and violence, but not surprising when you have understood that the projects of fugitive planning and black study are mostly about reaching out to find connection. They are about making common cause with the brokenness of being, a brokenness, I would venture to say, that is also blackness, that remains blackness, and will, despite all, remain broken, because this book is not a prescription for repair. If we do not seek to fix what has been broken, then what? How do we resolve to live with brokenness, with being broke, which is also what Moten and Harney called debt? Well, given that debt is sometimes a history of giving, at other times a history of taking, at all times a history of capitalism, and given that debt also signifies a promise of ownership but never delivers on that promise, we have to understand that debt is something that cannot be paid off. Debt, as Harney puts it, presumes a kind of individualized realization to a naturalized economy that is predicated upon exploitation. Can we have, he asks, another sense of what is owed that does not presume a nexus of activities like recognition and acknowledgement, payment and gratitude? Can debt become a principle of elaboration? Moten links economic debt to the brokenness of being in the interview with Stefan Shukatis, who he acknowledges that some debts should be paid and that much is owed, especially to black people, by white people. And yet he says, I also know that it is, that what it is that is supposed to be repaired is irreparable. It can't be repaired. The only thing we can do is tear this stuff down completely and build something new, end of quote. The Undercommons do not come to pay their debts, to repair what has been broken, to fix what has been undone. If you want to know what the Undercommons wants, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queers, and poor people want, what we, the we who cohabit in the space of the Undercommons want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down that structure right now. That right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know live outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn stuff down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break, and both are necessarily different from the desires that issue from being in the dark. Let's come at this by another path. In the melancholic and visionary 2009 film version of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963, Max, the small seeker who leaves his room, his home, his family to find the world beyond, finds a world of lost and lonely beasts, and they promptly make him their king. Max is the first king the wild things have had, whom they did not eat and who did not, in turn, try to eat them. And the beasts are the first grown things that Max has met who want his opinion, his judgment, and his rule. Max's power is that he is small while they are big. He promises the beasts that he has no plans to eat them, and that this is more than anyone has ever promised them. He promises them that he will find ways through and around and will slip through the cracks and re-crack the cracks if they fill up. He promises to keep sadness at bay and to make the world with the wild creatures that roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. That Max fails to make the wild things happy or to save them or to make the world with them is less important than the fact that he found them and he recognized in them the end of something and potentially the path to an alternative in his world, or an alternative to his world, excuse me. The wild things were not the utopian creatures of fairy tales. They were the rejected and lost subjects of the world Max had left behind. And because he shuttles between the Oedipal land where his mother rules and the ruined world of the wild, he knows the parameters of the real. He sees what is included and what is left out. And he is now able to set sail for another place, a place that is neither the home he left nor the home to which he wants to return. Moten and Harney want to gesture to another place, a wild place that is not simply the leftover space that limbs real and regulated zones of polite society. Rather, it is a wild place that continuously produces its own unregulated wilderness. The zone we enter through Moten and Harney is ongoing and exists in the present, and as Harney puts it, some kind of demand is already being enacted, fulfilled in the call itself. While describing the riots of London in 2011, Harney suggests that the riots and insurrections do not separate out the request, the demand, and the call. Rather, they enact the one in the other. The book is The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Boy, I can hardly talk, but I'm here. Thom Hartmann broadcasting live from KWAI in Honolulu, Hawaii. And I have a little bit of a problem with my voice, but I'm feeling fine. You know, I guess this is what happens when you have long airplane flights. Anyhow, it's Wednesday. It's our first hour. Let's start out with middays with Congressman Mark Pocan on the line with us. And Congressman, first of all, welcome to the program. Welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here, and I hope your voice does sound like you're not feeling well. I hope you're feeling well. As you sound, like I said, a little rough. I feel bad for you.
Yeah, it was getting pretty scary last night, and Louise carries some C-Pro for travelers' problems. You know, when we go into the third world. Yeah. And I took the C-Pro and it knocked it right out. But now it's just like this is the recovery kind of thing. Anyhow, I'm fine. Yeah. I am curious your thoughts. Today is the anniversary of the murder, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and the president issued a proclamation, and he says it is not government that will achieve Dr. King's ideals. Is this another right-wing trope about how we've got to turn everything over to private enterprise?
The president has no idea what those ideals are. I mean, clearly, he has governed in the last year in a way that only racists could love, right? I mean, I think the rock bottom for me was when he, after the Charlottesville protests and the person was killed, when he said there were very fine people who were Klansmen and neo-Nazis. That's what the president believes in his heart, and that's how he's governed. And for him to even pretend he understands an inkling of what Martin Luther King fought for and what this country is all about is pretty ridiculous. So on a day like today, I just count this as one of those days that we remember what we can be as a people rather than what people like Donald Trump want us to be.
Yeah. I'm also curious your thoughts on the Wisconsin Supreme Court victory, and if you want to first explain to people who don't live in Wisconsin what the stakes were and who the players were.
Yeah, it was a big win, in fact, on multiple fronts. And I think, again, when people are looking for positive signs about where this country is going and where November can go, we had a big victory in Wisconsin. So we elect our Supreme Court justices to 10-year terms in nonpartisan elections in Wisconsin. And the last several years, the last decade, it's been dominated by outside big money from conservative groups, basically buying a 5-2 majority on the Supreme Court here in Wisconsin. So we went from having a pretty balanced court to all of a sudden this conservative court. Well, yesterday what was a big change. We won with a person who I guess you would affiliate more along the progressive thinking of lines, of where politics came, but. Across the state, we saw a strong Democratic turnout come out in progressive turnout. My county, my home county, Dane County, Tom, went over 80% for Rebecca Dallett, who was elected to the Supreme Court. That's about 2/3 of the population of my congressional district. So it's pretty amazing when you look across the state in parts that Trump did really, really well. Rebecca Dallett did really, really well. And again, we're seeing our base come out. Also, equally important, I think, we had a referendum to get rid of the state treasurer's office. Scott Walker is trying to consolidate power and get rid of an independently elected position. And again, by about the same margin, about a 60-40 margin, they voted not to do that. And I think it was 60-40. It might have been slightly less than that. But a big margin decided not to give Scott Walker more power than he currently has. So as you look towards November and you look at these counties where the breakout happened, clearly we're continuing to see our base get out and are concerned about the direction of this country. The conservative base not as energized, and a lot of folks who are kind of in the middle or more independent also not happy with where this White House is, where this Congress is, and where governors like Scott Walker are. So it was a really big victory, and people should be very heartened by it.
Yeah. And finally, before we pick up calls here, Trump's crazy week so far, your thoughts on what he's been up to this week?
I'll tell you, Tom, this has been more stuff this week than I can even keep up with, from his feud with Amazon, which has been completely incorrectly representing how, the Postal Service works. If he wants to fix the problems with the Postal Service, get rid of the 75-year prepayment of pension benefits that are arbitrarily put on that agency and no other agency, that's the problem. But, it's not, people who are actually paying package delivery is something that's profitable for the Postal Service, so he's been wrong on that. He's talking about putting military at the border, which I think we could have an hour conversation on that alone. He's talking, he's got his Scott Pruitt. We got Republicans now calling for resignation. The EPA is trying to gut a major federal rule around climate protection in automobiles. We've got the president and tweeting about Sinclair Broadcasting after we watch the debacle, what they've had going on. And I need to breathe before I can get to the rest of the issues, Tom. So it's been a very, very busy week. President, again, is in free fall. And, I look at the election results yesterday as something I think that can give us strong hope that as we see all of these things moving forward, we've got within our sights the ability to stop a lot of these bad things from actually ever happening.
Amen. Let's pick up some phone calls here. Gordon in Seattle, Washington. Gordon, thanks for listening to KBCS. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, I was just wondering, with this whole Sinclair fiasco and all the talk about fake news, how come no one's jumping on reinstating the fairness doctrine? You could play both sides. In liberal districts, you could say it's time to rein in Fox News and reinstate the fairness doctrine, and in conservative areas, you could say it's time to rein in the liberal media and reinstate the fairness doctrine. And how is that done? Is that a law or an executive order? How do you reinstate the fairness doctrine?
Yeah, Gordon, so that's, something that we've talked about on this program just previously, much before we saw this, I think, amazing video on Sinclair with, all their broadcasters across the country doing the exact same words on some of these issues, and the fact that they have a fake news segment now and all the rest. I think the reason you're probably not hearing more is we're not in session. Right now, this is our Easter spring in-district period. So, I'm going around my district having town halls. I'm hearing issues like this come up. We have another one in Madison, Wisconsin, actually tonight. We're doing one this Saturday in Paul Ryan's district, again, since he quit doing them. Randy Bryce and I are going to have one at 1 o'clock at the UAW Hall in Janesville, since Paul hasn't done one for nearly 3 years. So it's a subject that I am quite sure is going to come up when we get back, and more people will be talking about, but I do think it's something that, it's pretty amazing, right? You talk about antitrust and other things just within media. Clearly, it's antitrust outside the media also that's an issue. This just points to the very problem that you're, I think, recommending we do something about, and I think you're going to see more of a conversation very soon.
Yeah, I think more than rolling back the Fairness Doctrine, it would be rolling back the 1996 Telecommunications Act, because that's what allowed, prior to that, I think an individual or a company could only own like 7 television stations or something like that.
Yeah, and with Sinclair, I mean, it's so obvious to people now. But I'll tell you, I could go on and on about antitrust in general, Tom. And we just started an antitrust caucus. It's a lot of industries are having consolidation like this, and we need to act on it even broader than just in media.
Yeah, we need Teddy Roosevelt. Congressman Mark Pocan with us. Pocan.house.gov is his website. You can tweet him at Rep Mark Pocan. And we'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan. And welcome back. Paul in Hayesville, Kansas. Hey, Paul, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello, gentlemen. Tom, please try to stay off your voice. Perhaps elevate it with a pillow or something. Bless your spirit, too. And
thank you.
Congressman Pocan, I find it a bit distasteful, this following thought experiment. However, that said, during the previous administration, the conservatives had this, what do you call it, a meme, that they were going to get put in FEMA camps. Well, Tom's lucky he's outside the wall. What about a progressive meme? The military line along our southern frontier is so the conservatives can put us in progressive FEMA camps? I don't understand. I don't think I want to understand. Thanks for everything you two do.
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul. And I got to tell you, I mean, I was rather shocked to see the president. I mean, he is so desperate for a win on this. And when the Republicans, as they put their omnibus bill in there, not only did they not put money in for the wall, but the money that they did have for border protection, they explicitly said couldn't be used for his wall. It was the biggest middle finger, I think, from his own party he could have possibly saw, because we didn't want to see it happen either. But he's so desperate on this. So now he's talking about putting the military there, which is a whole other conversation. And I think when we get back, I've got the feeling you're going to see lots of members of Congress talking about that, because we don't want to see the military misused for the president's folly along the border. And it definitely is going to need a reaction. But this is the president's white whale. He is just so, after this issue and not winning, but his base, the racist base that he has that thinks this issue is the top priority, he is just trying to appease and somehow, deliver on. But this is how inept this president is. He can't even deliver on a major priority because everyone thinks it's stupid, and yet here now he's going to do something that is even more stupid, perhaps, by putting the military there. So look for more action when we get back. I think this is a story that's just unfolding, and I think we'll have Republican support, I would hope, on this as well, because this is a misuse of our military.
Congressman, we're close to the break. How do you think DACA is going to play out in the courts?
Right now at least, we've got the reprieve of the artificial deadline. The president, again, obsessed on trying to pass blame on what he broke. No one's buying it. Again, people are so much smarter than some elected officials think they are. And in this case, people understand that it wasn't a problem until Donald Trump broke it. And now, we'll see what happens as the courts continue to proceed. I'm hopeful we can still find a permanent legislative solution. Over 50 Republicans are either onto a bill or a letter to fix DACA. You add that to the Democrats, and you have more than enough votes to do the right thing.
Then why won't Paul Ryan allow a vote? Is that the deal?
Well, I think if not, we got to make some noise back in his district. That's why I'll be down there again on Saturday with the town hall.
Yeah, good on you. We'll be right back with Congressman Pocan. Stick around. Taking your calls. And Ralph in Plano, Illinois. Ralph, you are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
I was calling because I went through my magazine collection, Tom and Senator. I went back and found my Fortune magazine from May 1st of 2016, and Trump's on the cover as a candidate. On page 124, he says, and this is a quote of Donald Trump, "I'm the strategist." He recently bragged to New York Magazine, the same magazine that just put him on the cover as a pig, which I thought was a perfect likeness, explaining that he has been the architect of his unorthodox campaign and unexpected political success. So he's taking full credit for his campaign, and he was the architect of it. How's he going to get out of this one when all this Russia collusion is exposed? He's either got to lie and say that he was lying and taking credit for something he didn't architect, or he's going to have to admit that he knew all about it. I just really want to, get that across. But last night on the Comedy Channel on the President's Show, I saw my fantasy come true. He was taken out of the White House, arrested, and in handcuffs. And I just want to hear your comments. I'll get off the line. Thanks so much for taking the call. God bless you.
Yeah, hey, Ralph. Thanks for bringing up that article. And you're right. Look at the hypocrisy. This guy will say anything, and he can do a 180 and say something different. And unfortunately for him, these words are on the record. So whether it be how his lawyers have handled the Stormy Daniels case, and he's probably going to have to pay for that, to, saying he knew everything about the campaign, and then, of course, except for the things that might get him in trouble, he'll try to step away from. But I will give him this. He has been, I think, masterful in many ways of reading the public and presenting some issues. For example, the swamp. He coined that term. He is right. There truly is a swamp in the Beltway. The problem is he just built a high-rise condo on the swamp. He just put in a higher class of swamp creature, more Goldman Sachs, more folks like that, who are still the same problems that are out there. But he identified it right. And I think, Bernie Sanders also identified it and did well on the Democratic side because he really was in touch with that part of the angst that's out there. So, I think you're right. There's a lot of hypocrisy in what he says, and he will very likely pay a price for some of that hypocrisy. But I also, think that we all should recognize he recognized part of the problem, and I think we're wise to also recognize that until you address the big corporations and Wall Street and everything else that's out there, that also is the swamp. And if we don't address it, we're not going to do well come November or in the future.
And ironically, Trump campaigned on that, and now he's doing the exact opposite of what he campaigned on.
Exactly. It's just the constant hypocrisy, like Ralph pointed out in his other comments. But to his credit, I mean, he identified a real problem that exists. The problem is he just then exploited it.
Yeah. Dave in Hot Springs Village, Arkansas. Dave, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Mark.
Hey,
I've been listening to you guys talking about sending the military down to the border, and I don't know what they're going to do there except observe. It seems to me, or I've heard, that there's a law against them arresting people dating back to 1868. I don't know the name of the law. Do you guys know?
Posse Comitatus.
Pardon me?
It was 1878. It's the Posse Comitatus Act. Congressman?
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, this is just, again, one of the president's, ridiculous ideas he puts out there that, if we have to provide clarity, we're going to provide clarity. And I hope that there would be bipartisan clarity on this because this would be a misuse of the military. He's just desperate to have a win on the wall. I mean, what he loves more than anything is going to a rally and having a lot of his base that really are racist be there because they love the border because of the racist aspects of it. And he's just trying to keep that love and affection while he's going around banging into all the furniture and everything else that he's destroying during his presidency. So, this is just his white whale. He's going to keep working on this issue. But fortunately, right now, we're able to hold it back, including in the omnibus. And he's going to continue to try to keep his base happy. But the good news is we're winning on this. And let's make sure we remember that.
Congressman, we have about 40 seconds to the break. You mentioned that you have enough votes in the House for at least one piece of legislation that Paul Ryan won't bring to the floor. Is there going to be a concerted effort to point out how Paul Ryan is obstructing actual bipartisan legislation?
Well, and you're right. It's more than one. It's a DACA bill. It's Perkins Loans reauthorization. We have 245 bipartisan co-sponsors on a bill that I and Representative Stefanik have, and Paul Ryan, because he lets the Tea Party have the keys to the car, we won't get to getting those things done. So absolutely, Paul Ryan has done a disastrous job as Speaker, and we need to make sure, well, the public actually quite honestly gets it. We can see it on polling, but we need to make sure that people get it in Wisconsin's 1st Congressional District, that their members causing these problems.
Yeah, let's hope so. It seems like people in Wisconsin certainly woke up, based on that election day before yesterday. Congressman Mark Pocan, it's middays with Mark, taking your calls for the hour. His website, pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at @RepMarkPocan. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan right after this. Stick around.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Boy, his voice sounds great there. We'll be back with the Congressman Mark Pocan right after this. Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, The True Story of the White Nation by Jay Sakai, published by Morningstar Press in 1989. This is from Chapter 2, The Foundations of Settler Life. The life of European settlers and the class structure of their society was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquest, genocide, and enslavement. The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor is a propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life.
Never has Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up above the level of backward old Europe by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of the New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical incident waned. Like many such fixes for Euro-Americans, this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. We'll examine this later in the relationship of settlerism to imperialism. For now, it's enough to see that this conquest is a material act of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the obvious here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settler societies throw off the propaganda smoke screens that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, "The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages," end of quote. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by white Afrikaner settlers who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses put forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs had allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kinds of tales any less preposterous than those put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was spacious and sparsely populated only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived at Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they were in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretching from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in Central Mexico, and an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and South America. These numbers have long been concealed since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their new world. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish reduced, in quotes, the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians who once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were in 1900 perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the United States. This was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers pushed out the Indians or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is that genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of virile European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The book Settlers.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you as my voice seems to be slowly recovering, which is a good thing, I guess. Congressman Mark Pocan with us, Middays with Mark. He represents Wisconsin's, I believe, 2nd District, Congressman?
It is the 2nd, yes.
Yeah, Wisconsin's 2nd District. And website pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. And Larry in Gordonville, Texas. You are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good morning, Tom. Good morning, Congressman. Just a real quick thought about the 2020 presidential elections. Whether or not Trumpty Dumpty survives his 4 years, we're still going to have an election. We need candidates. Well, I have an idea. I think Ms. Cecile Richards would literally destroy the right ability to take over this country. And while I was at it, I went ahead and picked her a running mate, Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas. Every spark starts a fire. Have a great day.
I think she should run for governor of Texas, Congressman.
Yeah, I'll tell you, that might be a little Texas-heavy ticket, but I know you're from Texas, Larry. What I do think you're going to have a slew of people running. I think you're going to be in the double digits in 2020. There's already a bunch of senators, House members. I think there's some governors. There's a lot of folks who aren't elected currently all looking at it. I think, people's attitude is if Donald Trump can get elected, anyone can, and it's going to be potentially a very good year for us. So you'll have a lot of choices, but appreciate the Texas spirit.
Marta in Big Bear Lake, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello, Congressman Pocan. I want to find out what are the
Marta, I'm going to have to put you on hold. I'm sorry, we can't hear your phone. She's on line 6. Arthur, if you can figure out what's going on there. Let's pick up Rob in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Rob, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes. Hi, Congressman Pocan and Tom. Hey, I just got a comment about what's going on with the opioid crisis. Basically, I think what's coming down is the DEA is coming down a little too heavy-handed on current doctors and pain medications. Because I've been tracking this, because I have people in the medical industry, and it looks like what's happening is, like 2 years ago, they started going into the offices and saying, you got to start, controlling how many opioids you prescribed out. And what's basically happened over the last 2-3 years is doctors are just saying, it's not worth it, I'm not going to do it, and they're just not prescribing opioid drugs. And what has happened since then is the deaths went from 40,000 to 60,000, where there are today. Now, I realize, and I have a lot of, sympathy for those who have lost people in this battle, but I think the way the DEA is going about it is completely wrong, because I think what's happening is there's no obligation to keep those people medicated and wean them off and try to, fix the problem. Instead, they're just being dumped in the streets, and what you're seeing basically is probably deaths increasing now because of the illegal drug trade. And, and of course, it just seems like the DEA is in bed with the insurance industries, because they're all like, yes, we're all for not paying for something. And I get that. They benefit from it, but I think the problem's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, Rob, so I don't at all disagree with you on, I think part of what the problem has been, people for a while prescribed opioids with very little review and restriction, and then we went to immediately tightening the grip on that, what sent people who might have got addicted or thought they still needed pain medication to the streets, where you could buy heroin very, very cheaply, and then we saw the overdoses spike. So clearly that was part of the previous problem. I think, now that we're actually not just talking tough about opioids, but actually putting some funds that go towards prevention and earlier intervention, we can move in the right direction. And I just hope that we keep looking at alternatives in pain management. The Toma VA facility in Wisconsin that, was once called Candyland for how easily they gave out opioids, now is the national leader in alternatives to pain management, everything from yoga to physical therapy to a lot of other areas. And I think the more that we can focus on that rather than a pill, because then we'll have the pharmaceutical company come up with a pill to get you off of the pill. There's a lot of profits that might be there, but we really need to address pain management in maybe some non-traditional ways. And I think we might be moving in that direction, Rob, but I do agree with how you perceive the problem.
As much as in Colorado, I believe it was 25% decrease in opiate deaths, and presumably, pot is working well to wean people off these drugs.
Absolutely. I mean, I think medical marijuana. I think seriously, in our VA facility, we're using yoga, physical therapy. There's things like kratom that unfortunately are facing some restrictions. I think because we need to make sure people understand that there are other ways to not be addicted to an opioid that can still deal with pain management, and we should be double downing on those rather than, I think some cases we're not moving in the right direction.
Hang on just a second here. There we go. Troy in Charlottesville, Virginia. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello. I was listening to y'all talk about the Donald Trump coming up with this drain the swamp thing, and I've been listening to CNN, and they had a whole show on the fact that he got all his talking points from Cambridge Analytica, including drain the swamp, lock her up, build the wall, and the fake news. So I think that's a crucial point in all of this, that they were involved in getting him elected, and Steve Bannon and them came up with these talking points using that algorithm data stuff.
Yeah, Troy, I think you make a good case.
And it's a British company, and you wonder if that's even legal.
Yeah, and just, the way that, I think conservatives are better at doing these, very easy to understand couple word little lines that really can solidify. Drain the swamp was a proper perception. People are tired of Wall Street and big corporations and what happens inside the Beltway with all the special interests. And he properly identified it. The problem is he just exacerbated it and just made it, even more into fewer hands, and the same practices continue. But he identified it and got credit for it. And I think, we need to make sure that we recognize where the public saw these issues and saw the validity, that we also point out that, there's plenty wrong with the way big corporations treat the consumers, and how Wall Street still wants to go back to being casinos rather than, financial institutions. And people get that, and I think we need to make sure our message is as clear, but actually with some actual facts, as opposed to what Donald Trump put out there.
Marta, let's try it again in Big Bear Lake, California. You're on the air.
Hi, Congressman Pocan. What can the Progressive Caucus do to promote lasting solutions in Palestine and Yemen instead of war, military violence, and human rights violations?
Yeah, great questions, Marta. In fact, one of the things that we've been able to do, because, people don't know it, but we have a single staffer that kind of does everything for the largest values-based caucus in Congress. And we've been fortunate to have two fellows this year, and one specifically, one of the major issues they worked on was the Yemen crisis. And not only in helping us to raise awareness, but to help us get the vote that they had in the Senate, which is the first time they've ever, I think, had any kind of debate like that around what was going on. We tried to get something done through the House. Unfortunately, we ran into, we don't have the same rules as the Senate, so we ran into a few more stumbling blocks. But we've been taking on some of these issues, and some of us have been very vocal about, the issue in Palestine and Israel, that we have to keep our eyes wide open to the entire issue and what's going on. So I think you're seeing the Progressive Caucus take more of a leadership role, thanks to having some additional fellow support on this. But, we're a lean organization, and we're trying to find some ways to be more effective on the outside, I think, and we're going to be doing that looking at January and how to be able to raise the profile of even more issues that need attention.
Johnny in Lamarck, Texas. We have just a little over a minute. Johnny, real quick question for the congressman.
Yeah, good morning to you both. It's one thing for the Johnson or the Kennedy administration to federalize a state National Guard for the purpose of enforcing integration laws for students. But I thought we had a federal law as well as the Constitution that prohibits the deployment of the U.S. military on U.S. soil. Don't we still have that?
And I think that's part of what we were mentioning a little earlier about some existing laws, and he's starting to now talk the National Guard a little more. The president didn't know what he was saying. He just put it out there to continue showing he's fighting for the wall, and we just have to make sure that he doesn't somehow try to abuse our laws and our processes in order to keep his fantasy alive.
Yeah, this was, Johnny, it was the Posse Comitatus Act that was passed during Reconstruction because people were horrified by the, particularly in the South, I guess, by the U.S. military, operating within the United States. And it explicitly says that it bans the Army from any sort of police actions inside the United States. And that ban has been adopted by the Navy. I don't know about the Air Force and the Marines. I don't recall, frankly, but that's what it is, the Posse Comitatus Act that I think everybody's talking about. Congressman Mark Pocan is taking your calls for the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. It's Middays with Mark, and we're so pleased to have him with us. And I'm glad to be here, too, with live from KWAI 1080 AM in Honolulu, Hawaii. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan right after
Visit
this.
ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And a special tip of the hat to Barry Wagenvord, who is hosting us here in Honolulu. It's a great station. We're so pleased to be here. And welcome back. Jody in Hudson, Wisconsin, watching us on Free Speech TV. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Mr. Pocan. I hope you're feeling better, and you are political and mental health.
Thank you, Jody. I'm doing well.
Mr. Pocan, I voted recently on April 3rd in local elections here in Hudson, Wisconsin, and there was a question on the ballot about getting money out of politics, the corporations, and it struck me today as something that maybe should not be on a local ticket. Can you appease me somehow that this is okay or not?
Yeah, so I think, Jody, first of all, we should just deal with it at the federal level, right? I mean, at Citizens United, there's a lot around campaign finance we should do, but we're not seeing action. So I think this is actually a really great movement by local activists to put on across the state. There were a bunch of municipalities and villages and towns that had a ballot measure to basically say corporations are not people, people are people. And they pass in the high 60s on the low end and on up, no matter where they're at in some of the most conservative communities. And I looked at a couple in my district that passed with huge margins. So, again, this is trying to build the support from the grassroots. It goes back to if the people lead, eventually the leaders will follow. And I think by putting this on the local ballots, including in some pretty conservative areas, and watching this pass, it's showing people that this shouldn't be a partisan issue, that we need to do something about the influence of big money in politics. And I commend groups like Wisconsin Move to Amend and other groups around the country affiliated that are doing this. I think it's a smart way to show grassroots support.
David in Columbus, Ohio. David in Columbus, Ohio. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom. Thanks. Congressman, there's been a recent trend toward accepting single payer. Bernie Sanders introduced it again, and now it's got 120 sponsors. So does it sound hopeful, and what can I do to help lobbying?
Yeah, so first of all, understand a couple of things. We've had a bill in the House for a long time that John Conyers introduced, And since he left Congress, now Keith Ellison has taken over. And that's where we have the 120 sponsors, which is about 65% of the House Democrats, which is huge, right, compared to where people seem to think this issue is by the mainstream media. People have reached out to us enough that you've got 65% of the members of the House Democrats are on that bill. In the Senate, Bernie introduced a bill for the first time this session. He has, I believe, 16 additional sponsors, so 17 total, which is still a good chunk of the Democrats, not as good as the House has had, but we've had the bill longer. And now we're working very closely together with Senator Sanders in the Senate and Keith Ellison and other advocates like myself in the House to keep moving this legislation forward. So I think if your member of Congress is not a sponsor, I think it's number 676, I could be wrong, in the House of Representatives, I'm not sure a number of the bill in the Senate that Bernie's introduced, you should ask them to be a sponsor and to make sure that we're moving this issue forward, because again, the public is ahead of this issue much more than elected officials.
Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. We'll be right back with more of your calls. Welcome back, Congressman Mark Pocan. Middays with Mark, taking your calls. And Dia in Burlington, Wisconsin, if I'm saying your name right, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Congressman.
Hi there.
I work in Mount Pleasant, the area where Foxconn will be coming to.
Yep.
And I wanted to just share with you a little story. I have a lot of concerns about our lake. I feel like the minute I saw that they were willing to pay 140% of market value to homeowners in the area to signal that they really want this deal. And it's more than just the land that they want, that they're coming for. So a young patient in our clinic, a disabled woman she was disabled working at Southern Wisconsin Center, that's another discussion. She watches a lot of social media and the local news. And we were talking about the Johnson family is building a water park. It will be the first public pool in Racine. And she said, because of course there was a lot of controversy about this park being in Racine, she said, well, when all the people can't go to the beach, they're going to need somewhere to go. I was shocked. She saw through it all. And this was before that Foxconn had offered 140% of fair market value to homeowners. And I'm just scared, and I'm wondering why we are not hearing anything from the Great Lakes Compact or our senators in this state screaming about water.
Yeah, so first of all, luckily a lot of the groups in Wisconsin are very focused on this. Tom, the Foxconn project is the largest subsidy any state has given. In this case, it happens to be a foreign corporation to try to create jobs. Scott Walker, in a Hail Mary to try to make sure he can continue to be governor, did a $3 billion subsidy. But by the time we've added up the highway and local subsidies, it's about $4.5 billion to create potentially 3,000 jobs. But also they're going to be using millions and millions of gallons of water out of Lake Michigan, which we've been very protective of, a good clean water source of drinking water, in order to make that happen. So I think there is an awareness of what's going on. I have heard more about it. What I can't answer, and I wish I could, is what the Great Lakes Compact is doing about this, because I would think that they also would be concerned, given the fights that we've had to protect that water resource for drinking water. So there are good groups working on it, and again, it's just part of what Scott Walker did in order to try to create some jobs, to have a number. He is risking our drinking water, and we're risking our tax dollars for a boondoggle, and I think he's going to have to pay for that in November.
Dottie in Chicago, listening to WCPT. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thank you so much. Congressman Pocan, one of the things that Tom has talked a lot about is the strategy of the Democratic Party in really winning in 2018 and also in 2020. Jonathan Chait, who wrote the article in New York Magazine with that wonderful cover, talked last night at length about using what had happened to the people who were part of Trump University, that Trump had said all along in the campaign, I'm going to make you rich. I'm not going to make me rich, I'm going to make you rich. And I'm wondering if those themes can be taken by all Democratic candidates and used 1, 2, 3 bullet points as a strategy across the board in winning, especially in 2020, but also in 2018, that people have been duped horribly and that it's time to wake up.
Yeah,
I would like to. Mm-hmm.
Sure. So, the part of it is right now, I think the good news is the House and Senate Democrats are working together on a unified strategy, which I think is a good idea. They have right now it's the better deal, better jobs, better wages, better future. But there needs to be more of it fleshed out to actually make it have some teeth, and that's why the Progressive Caucus recently did a nationwide poll in 30 competitive swing districts to show hopefully our leadership the direction, and very clearly what you're talking about resonates. I mean, people are upset with Wall Street and big corporations, especially pharmaceutical companies. They know what they're doing to the cost of health care and what they're doing to us. They know that we need to invest into infrastructure and that we're not doing that, and that's could help create good-paying jobs across the country. They want us to be looking at a single-payer Medicare for All system because they understand the complexities and the problems we've had around providing health care for everyone. And so we've done that. We've put those issues forward, and we would like to show people, when you talked and look at what happened when Connor Lamb won in a pretty swing district in Pennsylvania, the major issues he told us that he brought up were things like investing in infrastructure, having people have a voice in their workplaces via unions, fighting to protect Social Security and Medicare, and he mentioned also the opioid crisis. Those are the sort of things that connected when he localized them in his district, and I think we need to make sure that we've got a national message that captures that, and we did some polling to hopefully help push us towards the right messaging, because again, Donald Trump did it well with those little catchphrases, but we actually have issues that people agree with.
Yeah, little catchphrases that Cambridge Analytica came up with. We have about a minute and 15 seconds to the hard break at the top of the hour here. What in your mind are the issues that we should be paying attention to? And is there any call for action this week? Is there anything we should be calling our members of Congress about?
There's a lot going on. I think this border wall issue. It's good for people to hear what's going on. I think the EPA trying to gut some of the rules, and Scott Pruitt pushing your member to make sure that we've got a couple of Republicans so far saying he should resign. That's helpful. And I think anything around guns, don't forget this Saturday there's going to be a lot of town halls in conjunction with the Town Hall Project, which has been an offshoot of the students at Parkland. If you have one in your area, please attend. They have a website, Town Hall Project. You can look at it. We're doing one in Janesville, Wisconsin, in Paul Ryan's hometown, since Paul hasn't done one in nearly 3 years. Participate in those town halls and make sure we're having a conversation about gun violence in this country.
Yeah, there's a lot on the table, and that's certainly at the top of it. Congressman Mark Pocan. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tom, as always.
And my apologies for my voice. Congressman, thank you. I will. Congressman Pocan's website is pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at @RepMarkPocan. We'll be back. We're going to talk with Lamar Waldron about the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Legacy of Secrecy, The Long Shadow of the JFK Assassination by Lamar Waldron and me. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, triggered cover-ups by officials. This is from the introduction, by the way. That continue to negatively impact American politics, life, and foreign policy. Legacy of Secrecy details those cover-ups and hidden investigations, many for the first time, including the reasons they were carried out under such intense secrecy. Most were spawned by John and Robert Kennedy's top-secret 1963 plan to stage a coup against Fidel Castro, a plan so highly classified that it only started to be exposed in 2005 and is finally revealed in this book. Their own confessions now show that three mafia bosses, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Johnny Roselli, were behind JFK's assassination. They used parts of the secret coup plan to kill JFK in a way that forced Attorney General Robert Kennedy, President Lyndon B. Johnson, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and high CIA official Richard Helms to withhold critical information not only from the public and the press, but also from each other and sometimes their own investigators. It's important to keep in mind that JFK was murdered just a year after the tense nuclear standoff during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The main goals of U.S. officials were to prevent a nuclear confrontation with the Soviets and to protect JFK's ally high up in the Cuban government, Commander Juan Almeida, head of the Cuban Army in 1963, still listed as Cuba's #3 official today. While U.S. leaders have managed to prevent a confrontation with Russia and preserve a critical ally in the Cuban government, this limited the investigation into JFK's murder, allowing the three mafia chiefs and their associates to remain free. As a result, the long shadow of secrecy surrounding both JFK's murder and the coup plan set the stage for the murder of Martin Luther King, ultimately driving two presidents from office and bringing about the murders of 5 congressional witnesses in the mid-1970s. Legacy of Secrecy breaks important new ground in key areas, detailing for the first time Louisiana godfather Carlos Marcello's clear confession to ordering JFK's assassination. Marcello's criminal empire ranged from Dallas to Memphis, and previously secret files at the National Archives have shown that he made this confession in 1985 to an FBI informant ruled credible by a federal judge as part of a secret FBI undercover sting operation named Camtex. Exposed here for the first time, Camtex yielded Marcello's admission that he'd met Lee Harvey Oswald and set Jack Ruby up in business in Dallas. The operation also generated hundreds of hours of heretofore secret prison audio tapes of Marcello discussing his crimes, recorded using the FBI informant's bugged transistor radio. Yet the FBI and Justice Department withheld most of that information from the public and Congress for years until its revelation in this book. Carlos Marcello wasn't the only mob boss who confessed his involvement in JFK's murder to a trusted associate. Legacy also uncovers important new information about Marcello's partners in JFK's assassination, Tampa godfather Santos Trafficante and Johnny Roselli, the Chicago Mafia's man in Las Vegas and Hollywood. Shortly before their deaths, both mobsters admitted their roles in JFK's murder to their attorneys. 2 of their associates with documented ties to the secret JFK Almeida coup plan likewise confessed. Using exclusive new information supported by FBI files apparently withheld from Congress, This book names two of the Georgia men who paid James Earl Ray to kill the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, white supremacist Joseph Miltier and Hugh R. Spake. Miltier, who had been involved in Marcello's murder of JFK, was part of a small clique of racists in Atlanta who used Marcello to broker the contract to murder Dr. King. We document James Earl Ray's ties to Marcello's heroin smuggling operation and long overlooked evidence in FBI files linking Ray to Marcello's associate, Johnny Roselli. Finally, this book explains why Ray, while fleeing to Canada the day after killing Dr. King in Memphis, made a 400-plus mile detour south to Atlanta, where he contacted Spake to get help from Miltier. In 1979, the last congressional committee to investigate the murders of JFK and Dr. King, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, concluded, quote, that Trafficante, like Marcello, had the motive, means, and opportunity to assassinate President Kennedy, end of quote from the congressional report. The HSCA had been created in the wake of Roselli's sensational murder, but the HSCA was unable to establish direct evidence of Marcello's complicity. And the same was true for Trafficante and Roselli, because the CIA, FBI, and other federal agencies withheld so many relevant files. The HSCA, headed by civil rights figure Louis Stokes, also concluded there was a likelihood of conspiracy in the assassination of Dr. King and that financial gain was James Earl Ray's primary motivation. But they were unable to determine who had paid Ray or how the conspiracy had worked because the FBI and other agencies had hid critical files. With the help of more than 24 associates of John and Robert Kennedy, backed up by thousands of recently released documents at the National Archives, many of which are quoted here for the first time, Legacy tells the full story denied to Congress and the American people, legacy of secrecy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you as my voice is slowly recovering. In the last hour, Congressman Pocan and I were talking about how this is the anniversary of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and how Trump has issued an executive order, or a proclamation, excuse me. And I want to share with you, before we put Lamar on to talk about this, what Dr. King said about the role of government, excuse me, in bringing about, racial reconciliation and integration and tearing down the walls of white supremacy and all this sort of thing. So this is from his December 18, 1963. Barry Goldwater said, "You can't legislate morality." And this is Dr. King's rebuttal to that 54 years ago at Western Michigan University, December 18th, 1963. He said, "Now the other myth that gets around is the idea that legislation cannot really solve the problem, and that legislation has no great role to play in this period of social change because you got to change the heart. You can't change the heart through legislation, that you can't legislate morals. The job must be done through education and religion." That's him quoting basically Barry Goldwater. He says, "Well, there's a half-truth involved here. Certainly, if the problem is to be solved, then in the final sense, hearts must be changed. Religion and education must play a great role in changing the heart. But we must go on to say that while it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. It may be true that a law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that a law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. So there is a need for executive orders. There is a need for judicial decrees. There is a need for civil rights legislation on the local scale, within states, and on the national scale from the federal government." And in Trump's proclamation today, his proclamation about Martin Luther King's assassination, he says, "It is not government that will achieve Dr. King's ideals, but rather the people of this great country." He's basically echoing Barry Goldwater. I can't believe this stuff is still going on. It's just astonishing. Meanwhile, Lamar Waldron is with us. Lamar is the author of Legacy of Secrecy, the hidden history of the JFK assassination, and Ultimate Sacrifice. I played a role in Legacy of Secrecy and Ultimate Sacrifice, but Lamar is the principal author of all these books and a brilliant historian and political commentator. And Legacy of Secrecy, of course, is about the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Jack Kennedy, and Robert F. Kennedy. Lamar, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you, Tom, and I sure hope you're feeling better soon.
Oh, I'm feeling fine. My voice just sounds terrible. My apologies for that. But let's get into this. I'd like to take the whole hour and really dig into what happened with Dr. King and his assassination, and what you have learned in the research, the extraordinary research that you have done on this, and many other researchers whose shoulders you're standing on. First of all, your thoughts on what I just shared about the way that Barry Goldwater was framing the need to ignore legislation around civil rights, and the way that Dr. King pushed back on that, and how this all relates to Dr. King's legacy, and particularly how Dr. King's legacy has helped to change the hearts and minds of white people in this country over all these years, as a Southerner and as a white guy yourself.
That's an incredibly timely question. You can always count on Trump to provide headlines, usually to distract from something he wants people distracted from. But what he said today ties in so incredibly well. I was so glad to hear you talking about Goldwater, because he's the basis of one thing we're going to be talking about today, which is that political climate of 1968 and how similar it is today, not just in a vague, abstract way, but in a very hardcore way, especially in terms of racial politics and conservative politicians. And people are going to hear about just some amazing connections here. But when we go back to 1968, things were so polarized then. And then it was kind of easier to tell, because you had people with long hair felt this way, some people with short hair felt that way. But even that can be misleading, because most of the, say, anti-war protesters who were protesting the war or who were for civil rights, they didn't look like hippies. They looked like the school teachers, in some cases factory workers, housewives, that they were. So, but people were very polarized, and it was no accident that they were polarized. They were polarized then because of the divide and conquer techniques used by politicians at that time in a quest for more power and money, and they were fueled by really, really big money. And that's exactly what we see today, especially with this last presidential election, in terms of Donald Trump, where you divide and conquer. You set working people of all races against each other. Now, it was a little more obvious back in 1968 because it was basically black versus white. Hispanic rights were basically still on the horizon back then. And, all Trump did was take these proven techniques that all started with Barry Goldwater, by the way, that Nixon had used, and using some of Nixon's same people, did basically the same thing. So if we go back to 1968, and we're going to get to why King was killed that year instead of a few years earlier when there were lots more civil rights killings. Why wasn't he killed in 1964 when those civil rights workers in Mississippi were killed? What was it about 68? Part of it was that incredible polarization driven by money and conservative politicians. And Nixon was using something called the Southern Strategy in 1968. The Southern Strategy was based on what Barry Goldwater had done in a spectacularly unsuccessful bid for the presidency in 64. Barry Goldwater lost in a landslide, but for the first time in I think since the Civil War, or maybe ever, Goldwater had carried the majority of the South. Okay, so when Republican strategists, and there was no better Republican strategist in history than Richard Nixon, the man that could get overwhelmingly reelected 6 months after Watergate. When you analyze Goldwater's spectacular loss, Nixon saw a way out of that. He said, "Look, if I can hold the South and turn that South Republican, because the South was largely on a local level, state level, was Democratic and would be for decades to come." But as we saw again with Trump, just because a state is basically Democratic doesn't mean you can't look at flipping it with some targeted tactics. And so what Nixon came up with a Georgian, I'm ashamed to say, called Bo Calloway. And if you and I don't play golf, but for people that do, there's Callaway as a name in golf clubs and stuff.
I have 30 seconds before I have to start talking, and you just disabled my microphone.
And that is
I'm sorry.
The Callaway that helped Nixon come up with this was a failed candidate for Georgia governor who had actually won the governor's race in Georgia, but the conservative Democratic Georgia legislature took it away from him and gave it to Lester Maddox, the ardent racist. So Callaway worked with Nixon to come up with this Southern strategy. And what the Southern strategy is it's a way to hold the racists, but also get the moderates, the middle-of-the-road people, the professionals, by not being as overt in your racism.
All right. Lamar, my apologies for stepping on you there. This is fascinating stuff. We'll continue with this. Lamar Waldron is with us, the author of Legacy of Secrecy, the book about the assassination of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, and Jack Kennedy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And we're going to get into how this all happened. Stick around. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Lamar Waldron is with us. Lamar, you can continue your thoughts there, and after the next break, we'll just recap what you say in this 4-minute break here.
Sure. So basically, in 1968, you had Nixon running for president as a Republican, and he's using tons of illicit money, committing treason, and getting the support of the most brutal dictators in the world, most of them, not all of them, to win the 68 election. And so that's the playbook of Donald Trump, right? And Nixon is then using this Southern strategy where you're able to hold the racist vote, but not being so overt that you alienate the middle of the road, the moderates, the professionals, the people that did not want to be seen at the country club as having voted for George Wallace. George Wallace was the openly racist candidate in 1968. Nixon figured, look, I can siphon a good hunk of Wallace's supporters, especially in the middle, and still get a lot of northern votes. And that Southern strategy was his way to get elected at the cost of hugely dividing the country, the same way that Donald Trump has hugely divided the country in the last 2 years. And so that laid the groundwork for what we'll talk about later, which is exactly how and why King was killed. But what most people don't realize, what I didn't realize until relatively recently, was that you can draw a direct line between Nixon's Southern strategy all the way to Donald Trump. In other words, this is not a coincidence that this happened. This is conservative Republican politicians using a proven strategy, building on Barry Goldwater's failed 64 strategy to turn it very successful in 68, even more successful in 72 when Nixon was overwhelmingly reelected, and then using it to elect Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and eventually Donald Trump himself, using these exact same tactics.
Wow. How overt was Nixon about this?
Well, perfect question. What Nixon did was, so instead of talking, even George Wallace was not using the N word in public by 1968, because he had moderated a little bit, at least in public, because he wanted, more votes. So basically, Nixon would talk about things like busing, things like neighborhood schools, preserving your neighborhood, that making it very clear that supporting fair housing laws was not going to be at the top of his list, making it clear that integrating school districts and metro areas was not at the top of his list. And to say, when I say it's not at the top of his list, he made it pretty clear he wasn't in favor of those things, but he would moderate his language so he could get those moderate votes. So, and in the same way, we haven't heard Donald Trump in public use the N-word. There are unconfirmed reports he does in private, but in public, Donald Trump does not take George Wallace's words. He literally takes Richard Nixon's words, like law and order. Nixon was the law and order candidate. Once somebody who traces right back to these things became Trump's campaign manager, Trump became the law and order candidate, which again is a code word for racism.
Yeah. We'll be right back with more Lamar Waldron. Stick around. Of secrecy, which includes a lot of detail about the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And on this day in 1968 is the 50th anniversary. And Lamar, just to recap the Southern strategy and how, what the Southern strategy was that Nixon rolled out in 68 in the election of 68, and how that Southern strategy has been used by Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump.
Sure. So the Southern strategy, created by Nixon and George and Bo Calloway, the failed candidate for governor, was designed to keep the racist vote in a way that did not alienate moderate and professional voters, especially voters in the North. So basically, you would use terms like being against busing, which they would always call forced busing, being the law and order candidate, to bring law and order to, the country that's being threatened by these lawless elements. And you would be basically make it pretty clear you were against fair housing laws. In other words, civil rights, for black Americans, any minorities, were not at the top of your list, but you would not use the N-word. You would not openly campaign that way. So Nixon, like I say, got elected in a squeaker in 68, overwhelmingly reelected, 6 months after Watergate in 72, did have that problem when he got impeached, as we may see someone get impeached again in the next couple of years. But there was a political advisor by the name of Paul Manafort. And I'm sure if I had $1 for every time you've mentioned Paul Manafort's name in the last year, I'd be rich. So Paul Manafort began his campaign life working for Gerald Ford, which was not successful, but Ford would not really use the Southern strategy. So Ronald Reagan learned from that, hired Paul Manafort, and so Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign manager, was the Southern coordinator for Reagan's 1980 campaign. And so right after Reagan got the nomination, Manafort arranged for Reagan to speak at an event I'm sure you've talked about before, at a county fair down in Mississippi, just a few miles from where those three civil rights workers, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, were murdered back in 1964, with nobody really paying the price for that. And so did Reagan go down there and crusade that we've got to bring the killers of those civil rights workers to justice? No. He did exactly the opposite. Reagan gave a speech at this Mississippi County Fair where he embraced the term states' rights. Now, states' rights was the term that Southern states had used for decades to justify their discrimination against minorities and to justify their Jim Crow laws, some of which were still in effect, at that era. So basically, Manafort used Nixon's Southern strategy to help elect Ronald Reagan, in 1980, and then of course he was reelected, and then Manafort kept doing it. Manafort hired a guy with a name familiar to some of your listeners, and I'm sure familiar to you, named Lee Atwater, joined Paul Manafort's firm. And Lee Atwater then helped to elect George H.W. Bush using the racist Willie Horton attack ads. And so and Lee Atwater really summarized the Southern strategy really well. He said, in the 50s you could yell inward, inward, inward if you were a Southern candidate. But by 68, you had to be much more careful about that and use the terms like law and order, protecting our neighborhoods. And then they just kept getting more refined. But again, when you go back and look at those Willie Horton attack ads that got Bush elected, I mean, they're just blatantly racist, and you can thank Paul Manafort for that. So now we have, eventually, Paul Manafort becomes Trump's campaign manager. And when that happens, people have analyzed that Trump started using more subtle racist appeals, straight from the Southern strategy that Paul Manafort had been using since 1980, like Trump is saying, I'm going to protect America from threats to, quote, our way of life, unquote. Well, he's meaning the white way of life. Trump starts exploiting the fears of crime. Trump just comes right out, takes the old Nixon Southern strategy label and says, I am the law and order candidate. All these other people who were supported by minority candidates, they can't be for law and order, of course, because the implicit message is that only minorities break the law, which of course is not true in Trump's case. That's really not true. And get this, Paul Manafort even had Donald Trump Jr. go to the same Mississippi County Fair as Reagan did back in 1980. And the result of Manafort and Trump using that Southern strategy is that Southern states provided more than half of Trump's electoral votes, according to a great article on the Facing South website. And Trump won white voters. It almost makes me ashamed to be white. Trump won white voters by 21% in every voting age group. I mean, if that's not a racist election victory, I don't know what it is. And then you've got Trump supported, the Charlottesville racist, his public support by David Duke, the way he does all like that. So again, now we're going to come back to Martin Luther King. And when we see how today is so much like 68 and that Southern strategy, and we're going to explain exactly why and how King was killed back in 68 because of the same divisiveness racially that we see today.
And who ordered the killing? We'll be back with Lamar Waldron right after this.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Lamar and I worked for years on these books, Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy, and Legacy of Secrecy about the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Settlers, the Mythology of the White Proletariat, The True Story of the White Nation by J. Sakai, published by Morningstar Press in 1989. This is from Chapter 2, The Foundations of Settler Life. The life of European settlers and the class structure of their society was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquest, genocide, and enslavement. The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor is a propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life. Never has Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up above the level of backward old Europe by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of the New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical incident waned. Like many such fixes for Euro-Americans, this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. We'll examine this later in the relationship of settlerism to imperialism. For now, it's enough to see that this conquest is a material act of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the obvious here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settler societies throw off the propaganda smoke screens that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, "The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages," end of quote. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by white Afrikaner settlers who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses put forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs had allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kinds of tales any less preposterous than those put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was spacious and sparsely populated only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived at Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they were in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretching from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in central Mexico, and an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and South America. These numbers have long been concealed since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their new world. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish reduced, in quotes, the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians who once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were in 1900 perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the United States. This was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers pushed out the Indians or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is that genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of virile European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The book Settlers.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And on the line with us is Lamar Waldron, author of Legacy of Secrecy, the hidden history of the JFK assassination and Ultimate Sacrifice. Lamar and I worked together on Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy. Legacy of Secrecy, of course, the book about the assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, one of the great heroes of our country. At all levels, frankly. I mean, he didn't just work on civil rights. So, Lamar, let me just make sure that Lamar is still here. Yeah, Lamar is still on the board.
Still here, Tom.
Thank you, Lamar. So, who had Dr. Martin Luther King killed, and why was he murdered in 1968? Let's get cut right to the chase here.
The very sad fact is that really just in the same way that, Nixon's 68 campaign was all about money and power, illicit money, I should add, with all the bribes he was getting and the support from foreign dictators and the treason Nixon was committing. Kind of in a similar way, Martin Luther King was basically killed for money. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And that's why he wasn't killed. And it's just ironic, because he had the biggest target on his back of all the civil rights leaders and had for many years. But he was killed in 68 when his influence was actually starting to wane a bit, because you had the rise of other civil rights groups, especially the Black Panthers, the more radical groups. And so, but he was killed for money. And the conspiracy.
How so?
Actually originated here in Atlanta. And by the way, people should know this isn't conspiracy theory necessarily. Congress, when they did an investigation of King's murder in the late 70s, they concluded that James Earl Ray had been motivated by money. And they weren't able to exactly pin down whose money, and that's where my research...
So when you say by money, what you're saying is that James Earl Ray was essentially a paid assassin, right?
Oh, of course. James Earl Ray had not only never killed anyone, he wasn't a hitman, he never even shot anybody or shot at anybody. He was solely motivated by money, and that's the conclusion of the United States Congress. The money, well, where did that money come from? So basically, the bottom line is...
hang on just a second, Lamar. If I may, you said James Earl Ray never shot anybody. He did shoot Martin Luther King, didn't he?
Well, I mean, great that you caught that point. He never shot anyone before the King assassination. And I should say there's a lot of evidence that he fired the actual shot, but it cannot be proved to a certainty. But as you'll hear momentarily, that doesn't mean even if James Earl Ray did not fire the actual shot, he was still involved. But he probably did, but we just can't prove that to an certainty. So, but prior to the King murder, I mean, he was a petty thief and crook. That's what he was. So, but here are the people who were making the big money on this. There were 4 Atlanta white supremacists. Okay, 3 from Atlanta, 1 from a little town in South Georgia called Quitman, and these 4 men, who the most well-known of which is a guy by the name of Joseph Miltier, the guy from South Georgia. But he was working with these 3 Atlantans and had been for at least 4 to 5 years. Every payday at one of Atlanta's largest factories, the Chevrolet plant, later the General Motors plant, in the Lakewood part of Atlanta, south of Atlanta. And it had up to 7,000 people working there. These were highly paid union jobs. These people, even if you were a high school graduate, you were making tons of money. You could buy a new Corvette Stingray. You can't do that as a high school graduate or even drop out today, that's for sure. But this was a different time. These were union jobs. And so, but this was the South, and you had many racist politicians and had those racist politicians for decades. So, some of those people who worked at that plant, and I worked at that plant when I was in college, were racist. Some were white supremacists. Those were very, the white supremacists and Klan supporters, they were a very small percentage. But you had a lot of other people who were racist because the neighborhood around this plant in south of Atlanta, which was, I would have to just call it a white middle-class paradise. I mean, it was just heaven on earth for people who would, say, come from Alabama or South Georgia or the hills of Tennessee. That whole neighborhood, you had this high-paying factory, you had these beautiful little houses, you had these great shopping districts, you had amusement parks, whites only, and if you were white, this was paradise. And what happened to that paradise starting in 1964-65, thanks to civil rights laws, was that Atlanta's cabal of real estate agencies basically started blockbusting Atlanta, and they started with the neighborhood around that plant. So by blockbusting, I mean they scare white residents into selling their houses cheaply, and then they're sold to new black residents, and the most blatant scare tactics you could ever imagine. And so basically they turned that neighborhood into ground zero in this blockbusting war. The anger did not...
Why, Lamar, if I may interrupt, why were these real estate people doing blockbusting? What was in it for them?
Millions and millions of dollars to found the family fortune, say, of, for instance, Johnny Isaacson, one of Georgia's senators today. So millions of dollars were made, because if you can scare someone to selling that house cheap, and then you can sell that house to a black family who before was never allowed to buy in this nice white neighborhood, you can sell it to them at a premium. And then once you move one black family in, you spread all these lies and rumors about that black family. And it was just, they literally carved Atlanta up like a steer, and neighborhood by neighborhood, millions of dollars were made. But the anger of the white residents, who now couldn't walk to work in the Lakewood neighborhood, they weren't a 5-minute drive. Now they take what little money they can get for their house. They have to buy a house way out in the suburbs, fight that traffic. Their anger does not go to Georgia Governor Lester Maddox, an ardent racist and supporter of Blockbuster. Their anger does not go to the real estate magnates. Their anger is channeled by the racist politicians to minorities, to Martin Luther King, who's the face of civil rights. And so these people were
Lamar, when you say that they couldn't walk to work, do you mean because they didn't want to encounter black people who might have moved into their community?
Well, no, what I mean is they were scared into selling their houses. So instead of being close enough to walk to work...
Oh, I see. So they had to move someplace else. I see.
And that someplace else is to the far suburbs, and so... And so they literally destroyed what, in these people's minds, was a white paradise. And the anger felt was toward Martin Luther King, because remember, Martin Luther King, based in Atlanta, he wasn't just a national story in Atlanta. He was on the local news and in the local newspapers, several times a week. So it was easy for these four white supremacists to point the finger at King and say, look, give us $5 this week, $4 next week, whatever, and we're going to use this money to kill Martin Luther King.
This is at the factory gate they were raising this money?
Yeah, they would be very overt.
As the guys were leaving work.
Exactly right. And when you've got thousands of people leaving work, there are all sorts of people outside. And of course, it always struck me odd that the General Motors officials never rousted these guys out, but a couple of these guys were professional men. One was a noted Atlanta attorney, the other was a dentist, in the neighborhood, and frankly, they didn't peddle "let's kill King" to everybody. To more moderate racists, and there are such things, sad to say, they would be peddling, well, we're going to fight against civil rights. We're going to take your neighborhood back. And unfortunately, General Motors, they supported groups like the John Birch Society, and so these four men would basically sell you what you were ready for. But the most ardent racists were ready to kill Martin Luther King, and they would be collecting this money. Now, what they were doing with that money, just like Nixon took a lot of his illicit money and put it into shady real estate deals, so did these people. They were buying undeveloped mountain land about 2.5 hours from Atlanta. You could see the writing on the wall, more people moving to Georgia. That was going to be worth some money. But let's say you're a racist and you've been giving $5 a week for 4 years, and nobody's even taken a shot at Martin Luther King. You're starting to get angry at these people. Hey, I'm not going to give you $5 this week. You know, you keep saying you're going to have King killed, and I see, you know, more block busting and black people at my kids' school now. My kids are having to go to school. This is also when schools were desegregated in Atlanta, and so these people had to have somebody, if not kill King, at least take a shot at him. And so they literally put out a contract through the prisons looking for a recently emerged convict who would be willing to kill or take a shot at King. And it was a two-part contract. They were willing to give a certain amount of money, $25,000 to somebody to be the spotter, and then that spotter would alert the actual shooter, who would make more money, between $50,000 and $100,000, to take the actual shot. But that way the shooter could remain in hiding literally until the second before he took the shot, because you had the spotter handling it. So James Earl Ray was a low-level escaped convict and drug runner for the Carlos Marcello organization, America's most ruthless godfather, that was based in New Orleans but controlled most of Texas, southern Mississippi. Marcello didn't feud with the surrounding mob bosses. He made deals with them, like the mafia up in Memphis, Tennessee, for instance, and Atlanta. And so James Earl Ray found out about this contract, whether he intended to be just the spotter or he wanted to take the shot. He sure never took any known target practice. He became part of this contract. And the reason the white supremacists, they first tried to recruit someone locally, were unable to, so then they turned to the professional, Carlos Marcello, to just broker that contract, you know, take a fee.
So Marcello brought in James Earl Ray. We'll be right back. Hang on just a second.
Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're talking to Lamar Waldron, author of Legacy of Secrecy, the book about the assassination of Martin Luther King. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Lamar, there are connections between Marcello and Nixon and Donald Trump?
Right. So,
or do you want to just finish your thought from before?
Right. So bottom line is, King was killed for money, specifically the money of these 4 Georgia white supremacists. And they, after trying to recruit some people locally, they turned to the professional, godfather Carlos Marcello, because Joseph Miltier, one of those 4 racists, had actually worked with Marcello on the plot to kill JFK in '63 and had talked about the murder of JFK in '63 a few weeks before it happened on Miami Police informant tape, and pretty much knew exactly what was going to happen. So Miltier was, you know, going back to somebody he'd worked with before, Marcello, you know, this contract got brokered, and it wound up in the hands of James Earl Ray, a low-level drug runner. When you look at Ray's travels that we outline in Legacy of Secrecy, they're just loose. They're all over the country. They're to Canada. They're to Mexico. I mean, he's just this low-level petty thief, escaped con is just like traveling everywhere. But of course, when you're backed by America's most powerful godfather, you can do that. So King is murdered, and Ray. Like I say, maybe he jumped the gun. Maybe he was supposed to be the spotter. King was getting ready to leave Memphis early. So whatever happened in Memphis was rushed, okay? But Ray made it, you know, he made it back. He made it out of Memphis. He made it back to Atlanta. One of those white supremacists, Hugh Spake, was called by James Earl Ray that morning. One of the other white supremacists apparently gave Ray get this, Ray kills King in Memphis. Instead of fleeing directly to Canada, he comes all the way south, 400 miles out of his way, back to Atlanta, abandons his car 7 blocks from King's home and office, 3 blocks from Atlanta's heavily guarded state capitol, because our racist governor thought blacks were going to kill him because he was racist, and then Ray gets a ride from one of these other 4 white supremacists to his rooming house in the northern part of Atlanta, and gets the bus, takes the bus to Canada, flies to England and to Portugal. I mean, just, you know, globe trotting like nobody's business. But the bottom line, so that's the bottom line of who killed Ray and why. And the reason they wanted an ex-convict was, An ex-convict like Ray would know that even if you get sent to prison, you're not beyond the reach of someone like Carlos Marcello or a white supremacist. You can be killed in prison. So that's why Ray pretty much kept his mouth shut the whole time and never really pointed at these guys. But Ray's own defense attorneys, they were all had white supremacist backgrounds, supporting white supremacists and mafia types. So, that fix was in, and that's why Ray never could really open up. But so let's go back to these connections between Carlos Marcello, Richard Nixon, and Donald Trump. There's a saying, the cream rises to the top, and this is the opposite of that. I don't know what the saying is. Maybe you do. What's the opposite of the cream rises to the top? Scum goes to the bottom. So back when Nixon was coming up with his Southern strategy and using it in 68 and 72, Nixon got $2 million bribes from Carlos Marcello, one just a few years after King was killed. So, I mean, these corrupt people just keep doing this stuff. Nixon was the guy who first proposed that Donald Trump run for president. In 1985, Trump's mentor was a crooked lawyer by the name of Roy Cohn, one of the most crooked lawyers in American history. And in the same year that Roy Cohn is Trump's mentor, telling him how to do all these sleazy real estate deals, Carlos Marcello is in FBI.
Hang on just a second. Waldron is with us, the author of Legacy of Secrecy, a work of many, many years. Lamar and I worked on these books for 17 years, as I recall, Lamar.
I hate to say it, but it was longer, Tom.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was by... Yeah, and you're the guy who remembers everything. So, just to recap, correct me if I have any of this wrong, Lamar. What you're suggesting is that there were 4 racist guys in Atlanta who were making basically a living, hustling money from factory workers after work, $5 a week, to kill and getting this money in order to kill Martin Luther King. They were using this money to buy land in North Georgia, and eventually, by '68, King was really having some successes. And the people who were paying them were getting really upset that he wasn't dead yet. And so they went to Carlos Marcello, the mob boss who was based out of New Orleans, and said, we want to hire a hitman. And so Marcello, basically brought in James Earl Ray, who had worked for him for years and years. And James Earl Ray and possibly another person participated in shooting and killing Dr. King. And then Ray drove to Atlanta, maybe to pick up the money, I don't know, left his car near King's home, in fact, and then took the bus to Canada and then traveled to Europe, to England and Portugal and whatnot, all because he was connected to Carlos Marcello. Marcello could make these kind of things happen. First of all, is that a reasonable summary of what happened?
Pretty much, with one exception. Marcello only brokered the contract, and that means he didn't take the contract. But he brokered it, which means Marcello probably had exactly, one meeting or one phone call with probably Joseph Miltier. Money was passed, not at that meeting, but in another untraceable way, the way that Marcello had. But the fact that he had brokered it, that once you have that kind of backing, then everything else can kind of unwind, and you can always call on his vast resources if you need to.
Right, and Marcello, for people who don't know, was also behind the assassination of John Kennedy, as we also lay out in the book.
And like I say, Milt Teeser, one of the 4 racists, actually talked about Kennedy's murder a few weeks before it happened on, police tape. But now here's something really important that you may not fully know about. So for the Atlanta white supremacist side of our findings, not the Marcello side, but on the white supremacist fact of these 4 white supremacists here in Georgia, there's new confirmation about that as we speak. Out today is a book by a scholar by the name of Stuart Wexler. The book is called Killing King. And what Stuart Wexler did was take our revelations in Legacy of Secrecy, and he spent the last several years digging into those more deeply, in addition to other aspects of his own research into various offshoots of the Klans and racism. And he has turned up some pretty incredible confirmation, even from an FBI file, about the things that you and I had written about all those years ago.
Lamar, we're just about out of time, and I want to get to this. What are the connections between Carlos Marcello and Richard Nixon, and Carlos Marcello, Richard Nixon, and Donald Trump? And we've got about a minute or two.
Well, as I've indicated before, so Nixon was the guy who first proposed that Trump run for president. They were introduced by Roger Stone. And yet Nixon had been taking bribes from Carlos Marcello throughout his political career, including just a few years after JFK was murdered. And then in 1985, Donald Trump's mentor was this crooked guy, this crooked attorney in New York named Roy Cohn, who literally told Trump how to become the sleazy, corrupt businessman that Trump is. And that same year, FBI files showed that Marcello was discussing hiring Roy Cohn to get him out of federal prison, where he finally was at that time. But here's the last important point is why more people don't know about how King was killed and why, and the racism that led up to it, is there are plenty of files about King's murder that have not been released to this day. They're mixed up with the JFK assassination files because identical names like Carlos Marcello and one of those 4 white supremacists, Joseph Miltier, they're in both files. So those files were supposed to be released by Congress. It passed that law. They were all supposed to be released last October. Trump was snowballed by the agencies at the last minute. He imposed a couple of new deadlines, March 26th and the final deadline of April the 26th. But I'm very confident that Trump is being snowballed again. All of these important files about King's murder and about JFK's murder that Congress had wanted to all be released when they passed the JFK Act back in 92, they're not going to be released. So unless people contact their members of Congress and the Senate and the House and say, you guys passed a law to release all these files, because I'm telling you, the JFK assassination files do have material about the people who were involved in King's assassination. But unless people rise up and demand it, as we keep seeing in more and more places, those files are going to stay secret another 50 years.
Amazing the power that the mob had back in that day. Lamar Waldron, author of Legacy of Secrecy and the Hidden History, as well as other books, including The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. Lamar, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Tom. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great talking with you. We'll be back. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeats.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
In the Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from American Holocaust by David Stannard, The Conquest of the New World. This is from the prologue. Just 21 years after Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populous island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus chose to call Indians, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. It took a little longer, about the span of a single human generation, but what happened on Hispaniola was the equivalent of more than 50 Hiroshimas, and Hispaniola was only the beginning. Within no more than a handful of generations following their first encounters with the Europeans, the vast majority of the Western Hemisphere's native peoples had been exterminated. The pace and magnitude of their obliteration varied from place to place and from time to time, but for years, now historical demographers have been uncovering in region upon region post-Columbia depopulation rates of between 90 and 98%, with such regularity that an overall decline of 95% in Native American population has become a working rule of thumb. What this means is that, on average, for every 20 natives alive at the moment of European contact, when the lands of the Americans teemed with numerous tens of millions of people, only one stood in their place when the bloodbath was over. To put this in a contemporary context, the ratio of native survivorship in the Americas following European contact was less than half of what the human survivorship ratio would be in the United States today if every single white person and every single black person died. The destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. That is why, as one historian aptly has said, far from the heroic and romantic heraldry that customarily is used to symbolize the European settlement of the Americas, the emblem most congruent with reality would be a pyramid of skulls. Scholars estimate the size of the post-Columbian Holocaust have climbed sharply in recent decades. Too often, however, academic discussions of this ghastly event have reduced the devastated indigenous people and their cultures to statistical calculations in reconciling demographic analyses. It was easy for this to happen. From the very beginning, merely taking the account of so mammoth a cataclysm seemed an impossible task. Wrote one Spanish adventurer who arrived in the New World only 2 decades after Columbus's first landing, and who himself openly reveled in the torrent of native blood. There was neither, quote, paper nor time enough to tell all that the conquistadors did to ruin the Indians and rob them and destroy the land, end quote. As a result, the very effort to describe the disaster's overwhelming magnitude has tended to obliterate both the writer's and the reader's sense of its truly horrific human element. In an apparent effort to counteract this tendency, one writer, Tsvetsan Todorov, began his study of the events of 1492 and immediately thereafter with an epigraph from Diego de Landa's Relación de las Casas de Yucatán. Quote, the captain, Alonso Lopez de Avila, brother-in-law of the Adelmento de Montejo, captured during the war in Bacalan a young Indian woman of lovely and gracious appearance. She had promised her husband, fearful lest they should kill him in the war, not to have relations with any other man but him, and so no persuasion was sufficient to prevent her from taking her own life to avoid being defiled by another man. And because of this, they had her thrown to the dogs. Toborov then dedicates his book to the memory of a Mayan woman devoured by dogs. It is important to try and hold in mind an image of that woman and her brothers and sisters and the innumerable others who suffered similar fates as one reads Todorov's book, or this one, or any other work on this subject, just as it is essential, as one reads about the Jewish Holocaust or the horrors of the African slave trade, to keep in mind the treasure of a single life in order to avoid becoming emotionally anesthetized by the sheer force of such overwhelming human evil and destruction. There is, for example, a case of a small Indian boy whose name no one knows today, and whose unmarked skeletal remains are hopelessly intermingled with those of hundreds of anonymous others in a mass grave on the American plains, but a boy who once played on the banks of a quiet creek in eastern Colorado, until the morning in 1864, when the American soldiers came. Then, as one of the cavalrymen later told it, while his compatriots were slaughtering and mutilating the bodies of all the women and all of the children they could catch, he spotted the boy trying to flee. Quote, "There was one child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead and this little child was behind following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling on the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and drop his rifle and fire, but he missed the child. Another man came up and said, 'Let me try the son of a bitch, I can hit him.' He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but he missed him too. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped." We must do what we can to recapture and try to understand in human terms what it was that was crushed, what it was that was butchered. It is not enough merely to acknowledge that much was lost. So close to total was the human incineration and carnage. And it continues.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the third hour of our program. So Donald Trump continues to make wild and bizarre proclamations. We're going to pull out of Syria and just abandon the Kurds, for example. Kurds are not at all happy about that. And he continues to trash the Iran deal, which has so far been working quite well for all of us. So let's check in with Dr. Trita Parsi again. He is the founder and president of the National Iranian-American Council, an expert on civil rights and U.S.-Iranian relations. He's the author of the book Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States, and the book A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran. He's been published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, LA Times, and other publications and news outlets and whatnot. You can find his website at niacouncil.org, the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, niacouncil.org, and you can tweet him at niacouncil. Dr. Parsi, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you so much for being with us. I just wanted to get an update from you. You published this recent piece, War with Iran won't be Iraq all over again. It'll be much worse. I don't know how anything could be worse than what happened to Iraq. What if Trump really does take us to war with Iran, how is this going to play out?
Well, part of the reason I wanted to write that piece is because I think a lot of people were under the impression that, correctly, that if there would be a war with Iran, it would be a war of choice. It would most likely be illegal. It would be completely unnecessary. And it would be because the people that Trump is now surrounding himself with, such as Bolton, et cetera, have been pushing for this for many, many years. And that this would be a significant disaster. But it was also important to make people understand that as horrible and bad as the Iraq War was, it was also a war that, at the end of the day, on the American casualty side, was actually relatively low. I mean, the war itself would only lasted 2-3 weeks. Didn't have that many casualties. Most of the casualties actually came as a result of the occupation and the insurgency, etc. The war with Iran is going to be completely different precisely because the Iranians have looked at how the U.S. has fought that war in Iraq and recognized that the big mistake that Saddam Hussein committed from a military standpoint was that he thought that he could fight the U.S. in a force-on-force, direct conventional war. There's no army in the Middle East that could actually survive such a war with the United States. The U.S.'s army is just simply superior. But the United States is vulnerable in other ways. If there is an asymmetric warfare in which there's not going to be the same type of a force-on-force direct confrontation, then the U.S. is actually quite vulnerable. And I think the Iranian strategy is going to be to try to essentially fight an asymmetric warfare. They're not going to allow the United States to choose the battlefield. They're going to make sure that U.S. troops and personnel and U.S. assets are unsafe throughout the region. And they're going to play on America's most significant weakness, which is its intolerance for casualties. So that would lead to a scenario in which they would probably try to strike a very, very severe psychological blow to the U.S. by engaging in operations that would lead to a very high number of American casualties very early on in the war, and hope that that would then break the American will, and as a result, the war would come to a standstill or more or less end without Iran necessarily winning, but also without Iran losing. It's probably the only pathway they have to some form of a semi-victory. And the U.S. is quite aware that it is very vulnerable to these Iranian tactics. In 2002, the Pentagon did a war game in which they thought the Iranians would use this strategy against them in the Persian Gulf. And that war game was a disaster because very quickly the Iranians, according to that game, succeeded in sinking roughly 16 American ships, including an entire carrier. If my understanding is correct, that is roughly 16,000 American dead in one single battle in one day. I don't think the United States has had casualties at that level since World War II. So this is, in that sense, a very different type of a war compared to what you had in Iraq, in which Saddam, at the end of the day, was not particularly militarily clever and thought, beyond any reason that he actually could withstand an American attack, which he clearly couldn't even succeeding upholding his defenses for more than 2 weeks. The Iranians are going to fight a completely different war if the U.S. chooses to start that war. I don't think there's any indication that the Iranians would start that war. But if the U.S. decides to start it, it's going to play out very differently than the Iraq War.
Dr. Percy, you've forgive my voice. I'm fine, but my voice is not. You have laid out in fairly vivid and horrifying detail how Iran would probably hurt the United States if we engage in war with them. We're not the only country that is calling for the end of this Iran deal. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that a lot of the pressure that even U.S. lawmakers are getting is coming from Saudi Arabia and from Israel. To what extent, if I'm correct on that, to what extent do you think that Iran would try to pull them into this conflict, and what kind of price might they pay?
You're quite correct. I think the main pressure against the deal is coming from the Saudis, the UAE, and the Israelis. It doesn't mean that all three of them are entirely on the same page. I think the Israelis are not entirely bought into what the Saudis are trying to do and also have their own concerns. And they may not want to go as far as the Saudis would want right now. I think the Iranians are going to, if they are attacked, I think they will proceed on the slogan that they have used, which is the motto, which is either the region is safe for everyone or for no one, which means that they would view the entire region as a legitimate arena for this war. I personally don't think that they would deliberately, let's say this, if they are not starting a war, but they are ramping up their activities in the region, I think they would still be careful not to provoke the Israelis too much. I think they would put their focus on the Saudis. Because
the Israelis
anything they would
power.
Well, it's more that any provocation against the Israelis would have a higher likelihood of dragging the U.S. into the war, and that's not what the Iranians want. But if there is a war that the U.S. has initiated, then I'm not so sure that that constraint would exist any longer. And on those circumstances, perhaps the Iranians would expand it in order to target them. But I think the Saudis are going to end up being targeted. And I think even short of a war, if the Iranians ramp up their activities in the region as a way of putting counter pressure on the Saudis, I think you'll probably end up seeing much more happening in Yemen compared to what is going on right now.
Wow, a sobering thought. We just have a half a minute. What can Americans do about this?
Well, I think the one thing that still can work in this context in which already, the decision-making process in the United States right now seems to be quite broken. It's been completely disrupted. But one checks and balance that I don't think Trump can undo is that the Pentagon is not going to be wanting to go into a war that the American public already opposes. It's so critical for them to make sure that the war they have is supported by the public, and that's part of the reason why it's so problematic for them when the public turned against the Iraq war. So if public opinion is mobilized already now against what clearly would be a disastrous war of choice, I think that potentially could be the most powerful constraint on Trump and John Bolton starting this war.
Yeah, so speak out. Dr. Trita Parsi of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, NIACouncil.org. Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for being with us today. It's always great talking with you.
Thank you. Bye.
It's a pleasure and an honor. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back. We'll pick up some phone calls here right after the break. And welcome back. Kenyatta in Redlands, California, watching us on Free Speech TV. Kenyatta, how are you today? What's up?
Well, I'm feeling okay. I'm feeling a lot better than you're sounding.
Yeah, now that I've started antibiotics, I'm actually feeling pretty good.
Okay, all right.
My
Well,
voice isn't.
That's the most important part. I wanted to very, very engaging and interesting show, Thomas, particularly your last guest. But I called to speak a little bit about your previous guest with regard to, of course, the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And one of the things that, and I wanted to make a couple of points, but one of the things that I did not hear you discuss with your guest, which apparently you co-authored some books with, was the role that J. Edgar Hoover may or may not have played in this assassination. I find it mind-bending to believe that he did not play a part somehow in it, because this was a guy, that bugged Martin Luther King's bedrooms and so forth and so on. I just find it hard to believe with that type of surveillance.
I can tell you what the connection is, Kenyatta.
Go ahead.
J. Edgar Hoover was being blackmailed by Carlos Marcello and I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, but the other godfather down in Miami, Santo Trafficante. And principally by Trafficante, because twice a year Hoover and his lover Clyde Tolson would go down to Hialeah, which Trafficante basically ran. And Trafficante would put them up at a fancy hotel and supply them with young boys and apparently film or audio tape what was going on. And Marcello got in on this. And Marcello was the one who facilitated the hit on King. So one of the problems that we have is what, Lamar referred to the JFK files. All of these files, there's hundreds of thousands, maybe over 1 million files that the FBI and other agencies are still sitting on right now that have to do with Marcello and the assassinations of both King and Kennedy, because Marcello was behind both, basically, or was involved in both. And the idea that J. Edgar Hoover didn't know what was going on is just beyond fantasy. Marcello was in a jail cell with a it'll take me a minute to remember the guy's name, but with a petty criminal, basically, who was put in as his roommate in the jail cell, in the prison cell, by the FBI specifically to bug him. And over the course of several years, Marcello confessed his role in the Kennedy assassination and his role in basically controlling Hoover. And the FBI has not released those tapes. We have a pretty good idea of what's on them because Lamar and I have interviewed on tape at length the guy who was in the cell with Marcello. And we quote him in our books. I'm sorry I can't remember his name. But so that's how it all works together. Back to you, Kenyatta.
Wow. And I did, and the second point I wanted to make that, today with this being having the significance that it does, I'm watching there are all kinds of marches and commemorations, if you will, for lack of a better term, of this assassination. And ultimately, Tom, and it makes me sick, I hear this question, is the dream alive, and so forth. If we're still asking the question half a century later, it probably isn't.
Yeah. If we're still asking the question a half a century later, we still have a hell of a lot of work to do. Kenyatta, it's always great hearing from you. Thank you so much. So very well said. We'll be right back. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. It's 20 minutes past the hour.
I think that putting a wife to work is a very dangerous thing.
I have some phone calls here. Maine in Chicago. Hey, Maine. Thanks for listening to WCPT. How are you today?
All right. How you doing, Tom?
I'm fine. My voice isn't, but I'm fine. What's up?
Okay. Yeah, well, I wanted to talk about these past 50 years. Back in '68, I was 16 years old. And I witnessed, King and Kennedy and the Vietnam War, even Kennedy's brother, John, President Kennedy being assassinated. But since '68, from '68 to now, that's been 50 years. And in those 50 years, what I've seen happen, because after when King was killed in '68, we had riots here in Chicago. And right now, you can go down Madison Avenue and see open lots where where buildings were burned back in 1968 and still have not changed. When they redlined the areas here in Chicago, they had no economic development in our communities. But when you speak on the national level, as far as now, we have the civil rights, yes, but we also need certain things to go with that, like free education, single-payer health care, in order to lift up the entire country. I mean, this shit, if they would just do those two things, single-payer health care and free education, this country would change to such a degree that it would be phenomenal. But we got these beasts in office now. We have truly a beast, and he's going to let the beast loose here in America on us. These people who are doing these killings, these murders, not killings, but murders. I don't know why they don't call them murder, because you go from killings to shooting to shots fired. And so they dumb it down each time. But these be murders that be happening, and they should call it as such.
Yeah, I agree, and very well said, man. And in fact, I would add, if you look at the people who are supporting Donald, and Maine, thank you very much for the call. I'm just going to go off on a little riff here. If you look at the particularly in the so-called red states in the South and in other places that have been impoverished by Republican politics, and you ask the question, why are these largely white, formerly middle-class people who've been devastated by Reaganomics, why are they supporting Trump, and why are they so gung-ho to bring back basically working-class high school graduate jobs, factory jobs? It's because the Republicans have made it so hard to go to college now that they have lost their aspirations for their children. They no longer think that their kids can go to college and get into a decent school. And of course, this is happening across all racial groups across the country. But this was not the case in these white communities just 30 years ago. And so giving up on the idea, on the aspirational idea, giving up on the idea of a better future for their kids, these people now are saying, okay, I'm going to forget about the Democrats and I'm going to go with Trump because he's promising at least to bring back factory jobs. And this is where there's a great opportunity for the Democratic Party to reach out and say, no, we can go back to being an aspirational society. As Maine said, if we simply had free college education for everybody in this country and good primary school education, and this is what's so great about what's going on in Oklahoma right now, and if we simply had single-payer health care. I was watching television yesterday and I saw an ad for a company that is selling reverse mortgages, they're buying life insurance plans from people in their 60s and 70s. They'll buy your life insurance policy, and they said, and you can use the money to pay off your health care bills. Well, why do we have health care bills? We're the only country in the developed world where people in their 60s and 70s have to worry, or at any age for that matter, have to worry about health care bills. Why do we have to be selling our life insurance and impoverishing our kids just to pay our damn health care bills? This is nuts. And again, this is not any particular race. This is right across America that this is happening. And these are the things that Dr. King fought for. He fought for single-payer health care. He fought for good union jobs and things like this. I mean, these are the things. So anyhow, Sean, do I have enough time to pick up a caller here? 30 seconds. Okay, I'll just finish up my rant. I was also yesterday. Whatever I had in my throat yesterday went into my lungs last night. I think I had pneumonia or had it. And so I just laid in bed all day and watched TV. And I was seeing all these ads for reverse mortgages. It's like the banksters are just like, they're sucking the wealth out of the American middle class. They're just like reaching in and saying, okay, now that Reaganomics has devastated you, now that Trump's economic policies are destroying you and your family, and you've got virtually nothing left, wouldn't you love to give the equity in your home to us? Wouldn't you love to give your life insurance plan to us? We'll give you a few bucks that you can use to pay your health care bills. This is nuts. This is not the American dream. We'll be back. We've got Carl Frisch is going to drop by, and we'll have more of the program right after this. Stick around. It's 27 minutes past the hour. The Thom Hartmann Program, Viagra for your brain.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Right after this, we're going to talk with Carl Frisch about the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. Stick around.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Cindy Sheehan's book, Not One More Mother's Child. I wrote the foreword to it, by the way. This is from her chapter Writings, 2004-2005, and this is from her open letter to George W. Bush, November 4, 2004. Dear George, you don't mind if I call you George, do you? When you sent me a letter offering your condolences on the death of my son, Specialist Casey Austin Sheehan, in the illegal and unjust war in Iraq, you called me Cindy. so I naturally assume we are on a first-name basis. George, it has been 7 months today since your reckless and wanton foreign policies killed my son, my big boy, my hero, my best friend, Casey. It has been 7 months since your ignorant and arrogant lack of planning for the peace murdered my oldest child. It has been 2 days since your dishonest campaign stole another election. But you all were way more subtle this time than in 2000, weren't you? You hardly had to get the Supreme Court of the United States involved at all this week. You feel so proud of yourself for betraying the country again, don't you? You think you're very clever because you pulled the wool over the eyes of some of the people again. You think that you have some mandate from God you can, quote, spend your political capital any way you want. George, you don't care or even realize that the 56 million plus citizens of this country voted against you and your agenda. Still, you're going to continue your ruthless work of being a divider and not a uniter. George, in 2000, when you stole that election and the Democrats gave up, I gave up too. I had the most ironic thought of my life then. Oh well, how much damage can he do in 4 years? Well, now I know how much you have damaged my family, this country, and this world. If you think I'm going to allow you another 4 years to do even more damage, then you truly are mistaken. I will fight for a true vote count, and if that fails, your impeachment. Also the impeachment of your vice president. The only thing is, I'm not politically savvy, and I don't have a Karl Rove to plan my strategy. But I do have a big mouth and a righteous cause, which still means something in this country, I hope. All of this lying, fooling, and betraying must be hard work, George. You really think you know what hard work is? George, let me tell you what hard work really is. Hard work is seeing your oldest son, your brave and honorable man-child, go off to a war that had, and still has, no basis in reality. Hard work is worrying yourself gray and not being able to sleep for 2 weeks because you don't know if your child is safe. Hard work is seeing your son's murder on CNN one Sunday evening while you're enjoying the last supper you'll ever truly enjoy again. Hard work is having 3 military officers come to your house a few hours later to confirm the aforementioned murder of your son, your firstborn, your kind and gentle, sweet baby. Hard work is burying your child 46 days before his 25th birthday. Hard work is holding your other 3 children as they lower the body of their big baba into the ground. Hard work is not jumping into the grave with him and having the earth cover you both. But, dear George, do you know what the hardest work of all is? Trying to digest the fact that the leader of the country that your family has fought and died for generations, lied to you, and betrayed your dear boy's sense of honor, and exploited his courage, and exploited his loyalty to his buddies. Hard work is having your country abandon you after they killed your son. Hard work is coming to the realization that your son had his future robbed from him, and that you have had your son's future and future grandchildren stolen from you. Hard work is knowing that there are so many people in this world who have prospered handsomely from your son's death. George, I must confess that my family and I worked very hard to redefeat you this time, but you refused to stay defeated. Well, we are watching you very carefully. We are going to do everything in our power to have you impeached for misleading the American people into a disastrous war and for misusing and abusing your power as Commander-in-Chief. We are going to scream until our last breath to bring the rest of our babies home from this quagmire of a war that you have gotten our country into, before too many more families learn the true meaning of hard work. We know it's going to be an uphill battle, knowing how Republican Congress is. But thanks to you, we know the meaning of hard work, and we're not afraid of hard work at all. The 56 million plus citizens who voted against you and your agenda have given me a mandate to move forward with my agenda. Also, thanks to you and your careless domestic policies, I am unemployed, so this will be my full-time job. Bringing about your political downfall will be the noblest accomplishment of my life, and it will bring justice to my son and the 1,125 so far, other brave Americans and tens of thousands of innocent Iraqis your lies have killed. By the way, George, how many innocent Iraqis are your policies going to kill before you convince them that you're better than Saddam? How many more of their cities are you going to level before you consider that they are liberated? George, if you had really any moral values at all, or if you were an honorable man at all, you would resign. My son is a man of high moral values and true courage. Humanity lost a bright light on April 4th, 2004. I will live the rest of my life missing Casey desperately. Thank you for that, George. Have a nice day. God bless America. We surely need it. Signed, Cindy Sheehan. The book Cindy Sheehan, Not One More Mother's Child.
Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program, live from KWAI 1080 AM in Honolulu, Hawaii. And please forgive my voice. I'm fine, but my vocal cords apparently are not. Carl Frisch is on the line with us. He's the executive director of Allied Progress, the website alliedprogress.org. You can tweet him at Carl Frisch, spelled with a K, Karlfrisch, and at Allied Progress. Carl, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Tom. You sound like Washington feels.
Well said. Well said. This too shall pass, Carl. Hopefully on both sides.
Exactly.
Yeah, there you go. You sent out, I get your emails, regularly, and I'm not sure if this was published anywhere, but it certainly appeared in my inbox, and I wanted to talk to you about it. Author of Senate Bank Deregulation Giveaway, tied to lobbyist at center of swampy Trump cabinet official scandal. This is bringing together, you synthesized into one article, 3 Trump scandals. You want to tell us the story?
Sure. I mean, it is about as swampy as you can get. So folks are going to have to keep with us. A couple days ago, a story came out about the president's Environmental Protection Agency chief, a guy by the name of Scott Pruitt, having rented a room in the house of a D.C. power lobbyist for an energy company. Notice the conflict of interest. He didn't just rent the room, though. It was well below market rate. He was only paying $50 a night. And it appears that his daughter was also there, but she didn't have to pay for a room. So some swampy shenanigans going on there. It was for several months. And it was reported that on the first floor of this house that these power lobbyists owned, there were regular political fundraisers going on. One of the people that had a monthly fundraiser at this power lobbyist house was Senator Mike Crapo, from Idaho, and he is the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, and he is the author of the quote-unquote bipartisan Senate banking bill. I still call it bipartisan. I just spell it differently. It's B-U-Y instead of B-I, partisan. Banking bill that rolls back tons of consumer and market protections that were put in place after the 2008 economic collapse. What's interesting about him holding those fundraisers at that house is that this guy, this lobbyist, was also a lobbyist on a host of issues before Mike Crapo's committee, including payday lending. He was a payday lending industry lobbyist. So this is the guy this is the senator who was shepherding this legislation through to give the banks a huge payday.
Wow. So, what is and this legislation, has it been passed and signed by Trump? I know it passed the Senate. I didn't catch if it passed the House or not.
So right now it's kind of in limbo. The Senate has passed it, you're right, and unfortunately I think 16 Democrats voted for it. But there's still a chance to stop this. The House of Representatives is considering the legislation now, and if they make any changes to it, and there's every reason to believe they're going to try to, it'll have to go back to the Senate and they'll have to vote on it again. What we hear coming out of the House is this guy named Jeb Hensarling, who we've talked about before. He's the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. He's a horrible human being, in addition to being the chairman, who opposes every.
He was also part of the caucus room conspiracy.
Yes, he is opposed to every consumer protection known to man, and he wants even more than the Senate is willing to give. So many things that would just destroy the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and strip away even more important protections. So he's wanting to add all of these different things to the bill. If that happens, there's another chance to kill this thing in the Senate, because a lot of Democrats who voted, unfortunately, for the legislation would probably have second thoughts if it's even worse. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. But I think the real scandal here is the origin of this legislation from a senator at the center of this Trump cabinet scandal that very well could cost Scott Pruitt his job. If people are reading about this online right now, there's a lot of speculation that Trump and his chief of staff are not happy with Pruitt over this scandal, and that he may be forced out.
That's remarkable. And so basically people should be contacting their legislators and saying, please vote no on bank deregulation. Do I have that right?
Yeah, they should be contacting their House members and saying don't vote for the Senate's banking bill, and they should be contacting their senators and saying if the House makes it even worse, you better not vote for it. Then they should call the Ethics Committee and say that Senator Crapo deserves an ethics investigation for this shenanigans.
Yeah, amen. Carl, you're doing great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
Carl Frisch, Allied Progress is the website and the name of the organization. You can catch Carl on Twitter at Carl with a K Frisch and at Allied Progress. Let's see here, Dave in Federal Way, Washington. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I hope you get to feeling better. Hey, I just want to comment about, your guest about that's writing the book about MLK's assassination. He also elaborated on how racism has subtle racism has creeped into the Republican Party ever since the Civil Rights era.
It's not subtle, Dave. They hide it well, but it's not subtle.
Yeah,
I get what you're saying, though.
They use coded language. And I just wanted to say that's still affecting things today. Like, I joined the Army in 1986. I retired in 2011. Well, one thing I noticed was when George Bush was president, towards the end there, a real pro-democracy sentiment developed in Ramadi, which is right near the border, Anbar is right near the border of Syria. And this effort to promote democracy in the Middle East, it was, people supported it when Bush was president. But I think what happened is Obama became president, and I know for a fact in the military, a lot of conservatives, especially officers, they lost an appetite for it. They didn't want to promote any sort of democracy. And I think it was based in racism, really, against Obama. They were okay with him, ordering the destruction of terrorists, but they weren't okay with promoting democracy or representative government. And I think, ironically, Trump is looking, because he keeps using this term, $7 trillion spent and nothing gained. And, I don't know how factual the $7 trillion is, but I think what's happening is, it was that 8 years of Obama and not any sort of interest by the generals to promote democracy through the Middle East is what's causing this belief that there's a big waste. It's a big waste.
Yeah. That's remarkable, Dave. Thanks for sharing that with us. I get it, and the racism directed against Obama was real, and it was measurable, and it was vigorous, and one of the cheerleaders for it, of course, was the guy who was promoting the birther conspiracy, which was a fellow by the name of Donald Trump, and we saw how that worked out. Dave, thank you for sharing your story with us. Carol in Murrells Inlet, South Carolina. Hey, Carol, what's on your mind today?
Yeah. Hey, Tom. I hope you feel better soon. I want to thank you for the guest from Atlanta. And I know you lived in Atlanta. I lived there for 12 years, and I lived in the part of town he was talking about around Lakewood, which is now Lakewood Amphitheater. There's an amphitheater there, but there's no, factories or anything like that. There used to be. The area where I lived was called Sylvan Hills, and at one time it was a white enclave, pretty swank. Homes are still there, and it's gentrifying now. It went black, right, as the author was saying, and all the whites went out up north I-20, and then now it's sort of going back because of the bust in real estate. But I wanted to talk about, he mentioned the whites-only amusement park, and I don't know if you know about Funtown, Tom.
I don't.
Funtown was the whites-only amusement park, and I'm not going to say what part of Atlanta it's in, but it is no longer in existence. But there are people living there who were homeless, and now they have shelters. Thanks, humble shelters like the yuppie, the tiny home movement that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have small homes that were built by Georgia Tech students called the Madhousers. So there are people who are living, and these are mostly people of color, and they're living on property in the city of Atlanta that used to be a whites-only amusement park. And I think the irony is great. I live not too far from there. I know people from there from working the census, and more power to them and for taking over that land where people were discriminated against for decades. Funtown eventually went out of business because of Six Flags, by the way. So that's a little more Atlanta history. Thank you so much for having that guest, and I intend to buy his book.
Yeah, Carol, does you were living there at the time. Does Lamar's description of that time and that era comport with your experience?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wasn't there. I was only there for 12. I lived in Atlanta for 12 years. I'm, originally from Pittsburgh, and but until I moved to South Carolina, I was in that area. But I was a community activist. I was a Metro Atlanta DSA steering committee, so I was very involved. And I lived south of I-20, so I know about a lot of that history. But what he said is spot on, and I'm glad that he's talking about it. He had a great documentary, by the way. If anybody wants to
we got a sense of that when we first moved down there in 1983, I think it was. And the first question that the real estate agent asked Louise when she was taking her out to show her houses was, do you want to see houses in whites-only communities or mixed communities? And Louise was like, I think I'd like to see another real estate agent, please. Carol, thank you very much for the call. Great talking to you. We'll be right back. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're going to check in with Talk Media News in just a few minutes. Stick around. Welcome back. Corky in Hilton, New York, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Corky, what's up?
Hello, Tom. Yeah, it amazes me how this country runs without a president. But I would like to give these kids in Florida an idea. If you want to stop all the trouble with guns, you got to have, before you can purchase a gun, you have to have an intact insurance policy for liability.
Liability, yeah.
And just like a car, you let the insurance company set the price because they'll never get cheated.
They're watching their dollars very carefully.
Huh?
Yeah, they're watching their dollars very carefully.
Yeah, let them do the background check. Or let the buyer pay for the background check for a gun. And it will solve a lot of problems because those who shouldn't have a gun won't get one.
Well, if the insurance companies are doing the checks, the buyer is paying for it because the insurance companies will simply build the cost of that into the cost of the premiums. And you're right, it works well with cars, and this is why I've been pushing for this for a decade or more. If you're a lousy driver, your car insurance company finds out about it, and they will. I mean, they've got their finger on everything, and they will simply raise the price of your car insurance. It's real straightforward. And so, to the point in some cases where people can no longer afford the insurance, and so they don't drive. Now, there is a not very progressive dimension to that, in that it means that rich people can continue to drive no matter what because they can pay $1,000 a month for car insurance, and poor people can't. But it's still a piece, I think, an appropriate piece of a program that would bring these things together. Corky, thank you. Thanks a lot for the call. Well said. Brandon in Orangeville, Illinois. Hey, Brandon, what's on your mind today?
Oh, how you doing, Tom? Sounds like you're having a little trouble with your voice. I kind of joined the conversation.
I am.
So I'll spare you some time here and do a little talking for you. But we got something major coming up in Illinois here. On the 13th of April, there's going to be a meeting in Springfield between basically Dynegy, this company that makes evidently most of their money from coal, and they are, I'm not sure if they've been lobbying heavily, I can only assume that, but there is supposed to be a meeting concerning all this coal production in southern Illinois, that they want to double the amount of pollutants that are being expelled from these facilities. And up here in northern Illinois, and evidently some of us have been switched over to use this dirty energy, where we have been getting most of our energy from sun, wind, and nuclear power, and now we have an energy crisis that people are wanting to willingly pollute for all over again. And I just wanted everybody to know, especially us in Illinois, that if we can get voices heard before this meeting, that we just
That's
cannot
great.
That's just a step backward.
Great. Yep. Brandon, we're hitting a break here, but thank you so much for sharing that with us. I appreciate it. We'll be right back. Ellen Ratner's up next with Talk Media News. Stick around.
Hey, Thom Hartmann.
This guy, Chris Kobach. Wow. Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Republican whiz kid. He's already become a Fox News national hero for saving America from an invasion of alien voters.
Those dangerous aliens, dreamer aliens, alien votes.
Republicans claim millions of aliens voted in our elections.
12 million illegal aliens in the USA who could vote without proper identification.
They're bringing drugs. Hundreds of illegals not supposed to be in the country, but registered to vote. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people.
Kobach has ruled that voters must prove that they are Americans to vote. But he was blocked by a lawsuit filed by a group of ladies he exposed as a communist front, as he calls them, the Communist League of Women Voters.
Let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Ellen Ratner's new book, Loving What You Do. And on the line with us is Ellen Ratner herself. Ellen, forgive my voice. I'm fine, but my vocal cords apparently aren't.
Well, I understand that perfectly well. So I know you did a special on Martin Luther King's murder 50 years ago today. What's interesting is that his work is being continued with the Poor People's Campaign. And I was in Boston at the time he was murdered, but however, I had lived in Memphis, Tennessee, a year and a half before. My father died. My mother remarried a man from Memphis, Tennessee. We lived in a place, get this, called White Station. And my mother took me to see the movie The Patch of Blue, and they hadn't cut out the part where Sidney Poitier kisses the woman, and the white woman. And when we got out of the movie theater, there was Ku Klux Klan in all their regalia handing out literature. I mean, you can't even make that up. Now, I know that you have written a book about the conspiracy about Kennedy's death, but the family of Martin Luther King has doubts whether James Earl Ray really killed Martin Luther King. They do think it was a conspiracy.
I think so, too. We wrote a book about King's death as well. It's called Legacy of Secrecy. And
I didn't realize that. Okay, well, we'll push it on radio.
Yeah.
Okay.
And,
so,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
What else is up?
Okay. So the president, of course, he tweeted out this morning, and he tweeted about the trade war, which he's not calling a war, and the border with Mexico. But his first tweet was about China, and he's now saying that China has a $500,000 deficit, trade deficit every year, plus $300 billion in intellectual property. Now, I don't know if the numbers are correct, but I can tell you, having been to China, that they do take our movies and our books, and they don't adhere to our copyright. That we do know is for sure.
Yeah, I've seen that in China, too.
Then he tweets out also that our border laws, he said, are very weak, with those of Mexico and Canada are strong. And he says Congress must change these Obama-era laws now. And that's what he said today. Also, George Mason University is very concerned about this border wall. And as you know, yesterday he said he's going to send the military. Well, he then changed it to say he's going to send the National Guard, because he would have to declare a national emergency before he actually sent the military.
Right. And,
okay.
and Trump and... No, go ahead, Ellen. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. The president also said he's not a target. Well, the president, apparently, according to Mueller, Special Counsel Mueller, is not a target of the investigation. However, that was said a month ago. Mueller still wants to interview the president. The president's lawyers don't want to. The president is willing to be interviewed. And frankly, if I were the president's lawyers, I wouldn't let him be interviewed either, but that's just me.
Yeah.
Okay. Now there is now 22 women. All 22 women in Congress want the language that and the law that actually deals with abuse and sexual harassment and all that kind of thing to be taken care of in the Senate and the House. And they don't know whether that bill is going to get passed. Congress does come back into session next week, and so we'll see what happens on that front.
Ellen, is this the law that has to do with sexual harassment by members of Congress and their staffs? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Wow.
Now, as you know,
and that may not even pass.
Well, it may not even pass. It may not even get to the floor.
Wow.
I mean, you cannot make this stuff up.
Yeah.
It's really quite unbelievable. Okay, now it's also interesting that Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg is going to testify next week on the 11th before the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He is supposed to focus on the protection of data. He has said that they have not been good about protecting data, and it is interesting that Facebook has gotten rid of people who are not protecting data, and a lot of those are people in Russia. They don't necessarily deal with the United States, but Facebook has gotten rid of them. So Facebook is now, I guess they're learning their lesson a little bit.
Yeah, those apps that were vacuuming up all of our information, but now they have all our information. I mean, isn't this closing the barn door after the horse is already out?
Well, that's what I think. Also, I mean, we do know that there are Panera Bread, for instance, 37 million people's information was compromised, and Panera Bread, according to the news, apparently knew about this for a year and didn't say anything. I mean, how do you make how do people not say, hey, your information was compromised?
Yeah, and Saks Fifth Avenue was actually keeping the credit card numbers of people who walked into the store and bought things. That seems to me like that should be illegal. I mean, that's where we need good regulation. Ellen Ratner with Talk Media News. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great talking with you. TalkMediaNews.com. Thank you for being with us today. Hopefully my voice will be better tomorrow. We'll be back from KWAI 1080 AM here in Honolulu, Hawaii. And hope you're having a great day. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us. That includes you. So get out there, get active, tag. You're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeats.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beats, THOMSBEETS.com.